Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about board composition, and specifically a study that shows a decline in select director skills that we're going to talk about a little bit today. So joining me from the conference board is Paul Washington, who's their executive director of their ESG Center. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks for having me, TK.
So the best I can tell, just recently the conference board and SGAGE, along with a host of partners, including one of our own, KPMG, conducted a research survey on board composition, focusing on diversity, experience, and effectiveness. So the study wanted to get sort of its arms around board composition in light of the greater focus on ESG, particularly with the SEC preparing to launch disclosure rules on climate and cybersecurity, and I'm sure soon to follow human capital management. So unfortunately, Paul, there was so much good information in there that will never fit into our time frame. So I took the liberty of selecting some of the highlights, and one could be argued one or two of the lowlights for us to discuss, and then we can tell the viewers where to get a copy at the end of the show. So the first thing that caught my eye was what I'll call an untimely report that the percentage of directors that possess strategic or international skills or experience has declined. And this is one of those, Paul, that I think can't be necessarily good news. So maybe you can sort of decipher the numbers and the possible concern here.
Sure. And thanks. You actually did highlight right at the outset here what I think is certainly a yellow, if not red flag for corporate boards, which is that we are seeing a decline in strategic business experience on boards in the Russell 3000 from about 68% in 2018 to 63% in most recently. And so that's a notable decline. We're also seeing a decline of about 20% in international experience. So take the S&P 500, where international experience over the same period has declined from about 20% to 14%. So these are really worrisome trends, because if you think about the role of the board, which is really to decide or certainly review the company's strategy, right? And in an interconnected world, increasingly facing geopolitical crises in, for example, the Ukraine, that have worldwide impact, the decline in those two areas is quite a concern. What we're seeing, conversely, is an increase in directors with more specific types of functional expertise. But if you lose the strategic experience at the board level, the board's less able to do its job. The board members are less able to have a common language with each other. And frankly, the board is less able to oversee management.
So that's interesting, because throughout most of my years, the number one thing that board members felt that they needed to contribute to was strategy, and enjoyed that the most, interestingly enough, because that's where they felt they could really add value, to a management team. But your issue about the specialist, if I look back, I think sort of the specialist kind of candidate sort of popped up when it was required to have a financial expert. Now, on the positive, typically that was a CFO or a retired accounting partner, which was pretty familiar with strategy or with, doing planning or that type of issue. So the board wasn't really impacted much. But a couple of years ago, we started to see specialists, particularly in the space of cyber, but occasionally we would see that with human capital as well. And these were people that had not run large divisions of the company, did not have a strategic background except in their specialty area. And Paul, my take was that these specialists they may have fit the bill for that one piece of board business, but we need directors in those seats that sort of can contribute in a broader scope. So give me your thoughts on when you see the specialist growing, what should we look out for?
Well, I'm concerned about it as well. So look, there's nothing wrong with having more in-depth experience in technology or human capital or supply chains or other areas. Like that's absolutely okay to have that. But that has to be coupled with strategic business experience because frankly, you want your C-suite executives, you want your CHRO, your head of human resources to understand HR, but you also want them to be able to link HR, your human capital, your workforce, to the broader business strategy. How are you going to take the workforce you've got now and have the workforce you need in another 3 to 5 years to support your business strategy? So you want that in your C-suite executives. You certainly need that at the board level. And lacking that is going to mean that the board's not going to be able to properly do its job. The other thing we're seeing, in addition to increases in the areas you're talking about, it's interesting. We also saw an increase in business operations experience, not strategic experience. So that means that as boards are looking to bring on folks maybe who aren't in the C-suite, they're getting more people who are in the nuts and bolts operations. That's also not a bad thing. But if you're doing that to the exclusion of strategy, then you're actually bringing in people on the board who may be less qualified to oversee your business than people in your C-suite. And therein lies a very significant risk for companies.
Yeah. So something that I was immediately drawn to in the report was the discussion about non-gov committees, giving greater consideration to soft skills and to make sure that they weren't relying completely on candidates looking at, quote, hard skills. Could you take a second and sort of talk about soft skills and hard skills?
Sure. So, we put out a report at the conference board on the shift from stockholder to stakeholder capitalism and how it's affecting the C-suite and the composition and the skills needed for CEOs and so forth. Definitely worth reading. We're also seeing an evolution in what's needed at the board level. And some of the soft skills that you need now more than ever before are the ability to listen, the interest in learning, and the openness to change. Because the role of the board is evolving, the role of companies is evolving, the issues that companies are grappling with, whether environmental or social issues, are broadening. So you want actually a board that's there to listen and learn and contribute, and not just to lecture based on their prior experience. So there's a different sort of mindset that you're looking for. The other area, and this sort of bridges, I would say, the hard skill and soft skill area, is experience in crisis management. Boards consistently rate themselves relatively low in crisis management, and CEOs rate their own boards low in crisis management, and CEOs rate themselves low in crisis management. So we have a crisis and crisis management skills at the board level. That's an area where you want people, who have been through crises, who have collaborated and come through them, who have suffered failures as well as successes on your board. You don't want just a bunch of people who have only known success.
When I think of soft skills, words that come to mind are culture and communication, which I would think today really are critical elements of anybody. Boards, certainly they have a board culture, but they're also supporting the CEO and the culture that they're establishing in their companies. They have to be knowledgeable and be willing to step in. And I agree with you 100% in the sense that soft skills are going to play a significantly more important role as we go forward.
They are. And let me just add one thing to that. So you're right. The board is often looked at as its own ecosystem with its own culture. But the board's culture has a powerful impact on management because those are the people to whom management needs to present every couple months or every quarter and so forth. So if the board culture embraces transparency, for example, and a willingness to question past practice in a constructive sort of way, that has a powerful ripple effect throughout the senior management and then beyond that. So board culture isn't just for the sake of the board doing its job better. It has a powerful impact on the broader organization.
Yeah, makes sense. So we have about a minute and a half left, but I wanted to just touch on the issue of board size. I saw in the report where the board size is growing. And I know for years, there was attempts to reduce the size of the board. They felt that while there was no data that supported that one board size worked better than another, I think everybody was trying to get the board down. Well, enter ESG, enter all these, enter cyber, and now you got committees popping up that weren't maybe there before that are critical to the success of the company. So subsequently, the board feels that it warrants a committee. And it makes sense to me that you have to have more people to sort of fill those committees. So is that one of the things that you think is going to be a trend going forward, that we're going to see this growth in board numbers?
Sure. Right now, we've just seen a slight increase from 10.8 on the average to 11.2, but I think this is going to be a durable change. Right now, it's a bit temporary because companies are going after directors with greater diversity. And if you find a great candidate, you're not going to say, well, we're going to wait 2 years. Can you wait 2 years till we have a vacancy? No, you're going to go bring on that candidate now, right? And so you're going to see a temporary bump up in order to bring on candidates. It's also good because you've got better board succession planning. You've got a transition there. But you're right. It's the committee structure that's going to drive this as a more permanent sort of issue here, and the broader array of skills that boards are going to want to have. That means that because you got to populate those committees, you can't have the same 9 independent directors serving on 4 or 5 committees. And maybe when you've got 3, but you can't do it when you've got an increased workload, more committees, you're going to need some more directors. I see us inching up from sort of the 10 to 12 level.
Yeah. Well, again, there's no statistical that's neither good nor bad. So that's at least good news. So unfortunately, there is so much more good information. We haven't even touched on some of the good information on diversity that you have in the report. So where can people get a copy and see the full results of the research survey?
Well, it's really easy. Just type in TCB as for the conference board, tcb.org. And when you're there, search for board composition. Or if you're like a lot of people, you just use Google or another search engine, just type in board composition and conference board, and it'll bring you right to the report.
Well, Paul, there's some great things coming out of the conference board. Your team is doing a good job. It's always great to have you on here and provide information that will be helpful for directors. So I want to thank you for taking the time and joining us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.